Good morning and welcome back now to the reading of God's Word. We're now at the end of this week and we're going to be in chapters 37 through 45 of Jeremiah. And in chapter 39, we're going to be reading of the fall of Jerusalem. This would be not only the end of this week's reading, but it's also the end of the free Jerusalem. It would be a long time after that before they ever get their statehood back, and we've already discussed that one time. But this is the main event right here, as far as this what Jeremiah lived through, and he is telling the story as a first-hand account. So at this point, Jeremiah is living out the very prophecies that God gave him in all of the years through the last few years of Jeremiah in Jerusalem. And the prophecies were all this is coming to pass at this point. But go back and read, if you get a chance, go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 28. And God had already told Moses what was going to happen at this time. And this would be during the time of the siege. And this siege, remember, it went on from about 606, 607, 606, somewhere in there, or as early as 610, all the way through 589. So these were over 20 years of siege that took place. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 21, you'll see what was happening at that time as far as the suffering inside the city. Sometimes it was under siege. Sometimes they lifted the siege just for a little while, but they came back to it. So the events now, as we read in these last chapters here, in chapter 37, we kind of begin with Jeremiah being arrested. And in Jeremiah 37, verse 16, we see that he was put in a dungeon. And this was called a vaulted cell. And this was a very cold, dark place. And he was put in there, it says, for many days. Now, after this time was over, Zedekiah found out through one of the individuals in his court that he was in that dungeon, and so Zedekiah went and had him removed and brought him out and kept him in the courthouse or the court of the guardhouse, really. So he was there for a little while, but it didn't take long, and some others in chapter 28 got a hold of Jeremiah, and they lowered him into a cistern. Now this cistern, and this is in 38 verse 6, this cistern is actually a very deep hole that is designed to catch rainwater. But at this point, there's only mud in it. So Jeremiah is lowered into it, and he begins to sink into that mud, and the intent is just to leave him there and let him die. All of this is to keep him quiet with his prophecies right in front of the siege that was taking place. But again, Zedekiah found out that he was there in that cistern, so he sent and had Jeremiah pull back out of the cistern and brought him in. And then right after that, they brought Jeremiah to Zedekiah. And there was a long conversation in verses 14 through 26, where Zedekiah wanted to hear Jeremiah tell him that good things were going to happen to Jerusalem, that there was going to be a way out of this. But Jeremiah was being very brutally honest to tell him, no, this was all going to happen now. It was probably something that wasn't going to stop, and Jerusalem was going to fall. So this brings us to chapter 39, and this is where we read of the fall of Jerusalem. And so it finally is down. The Babylonians enter into the city. Later, they would tear all of the walls down, and they would burn the buildings, but we'll talk about that shortly. And during the invasion, we read that Zedekiah tries to get away. He tries to run, but he is caught in verses 6 and 7, and he is killed in front of him. His sons are killed in front of him. And that would be the last thing he would see, because after that they blinded him. Remember that Jeremiah had already previously told Zedekiah that he would not die by the sword, but Zedekiah would probably wish that he had died, because he watched his sons being killed in front of him. Then he was blinded. Then he was taken to Babylon in chains. So not a good ending for Zedekiah. And then finally in that chapter 39, we look in verses 11 through 18. And Jeremiah himself now finds favor with Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan, who is the captain of the bodyguard. And they give him his freedom. He is released. He gets he gets to choose where he wants to go. Do you want to go back? You want to go to Babylon with the exiles, or do you want to stay here? And so he chose to stay in Palestine to minister to them. So that was Jeremiah's fate at this time. Now, he would not remain there. We're going to find that out really, really quick. In chapters 40 through 45, now these chapters cover a lot of different events here after the fall. The Jerusalem is in ruins at this point. It is still going under destruction. And so these chapters give some idea of what all of this is going to happen here as far as Jeremiah is concerned. So in chapter 40, Jeremiah stays in Palestine and ministers there. But in 41 and 42, you can read about a political discussion. There was political unrest here. There were some struggles going on because obviously the oppressors now were putting their own people, or putting the chosen people in charge. They were just puppet leaders for Nebuchadnezzar. And so there was others that were there. There's arguments back and to. There's some killings that take place. We could get into the details of that, but it would just take forever. So at the end of chapter 42, what we see here is, and this is the fate of Jeremiah, against the advice of Jeremiah, those that are left in Jerusalem decide that they want to flee and go to Egypt. They think they can find some safety in Egypt. And Jeremiah is telling them, no, you cannot, because Babylon is going to follow you there. And sure enough, he told them that the very place where they were headed would be the place that Babylon would set up a throne. And so it happened. And those who fled and went to Egypt did not survive there. And beyond that, they actually kidnapped Jeremiah and took him with them, and he ministered until Egypt fell. So there's a lot there in what was going on right after the fall. And then in chapters 43 and 44, as he enters into Egypt, we see that's a full discussion, both of those chapters really, about the events there in Egypt. So in chapters 40, and we read most of that in 44 in verses 11 through 14. Chapter 45. Okay, we come to the end of the reading for this week. 45 is only 5 verses, and it is Jeremiah telling Baruch, who was his scribe really, that he was going to survive. He was not going to be killed. And all of this devastation, that the Lord would give him his life as a booty wherever he went. Very short chapter 45, and that brings us to the end of this week's reading. But before we leave here, it is interesting, as the buildings were burned, the palaces were burned, the temples were burned. Back in 2 Kings chapter 25, you've already read this, but if you look really forward to Jeremiah chapter 52, you'll read the very same thing. And it is what happened to the temple. And this is part of this kind of interesting here. So as the temple, and notice this, as the temple was raided and burned, every object of gold or silver or bronze or any other precious thing that was there was taken out. It was raided and packed up and carried to Babylon. But what do you see that was not discussed here? And that would be the Ark of the Covenant. The ark, there's no mention about the Ark of the Covenant. So it survived from Moses all the way, even through a Palestinian capture, and it came back, and David finally put it in a tabernacle tent, and then Solomon put it in this temple, and it survived all that time. And this was where the Shekinah glory of God was, in that temple. But here now, all of a sudden, with no mention, even in the destruction of this temple, no one knows what happened to that. So basically what has happened is the Shekinah glory of God has departed the temple. Would never be back there again, as far as we know. So there is a lot to say about that. There's a lot of discussion that we can get into about that Ark of the Covenant and where it might have gone, but there's no mention to it in the scriptures, so it would just be speculation. So with that, and we reach the end of this week's reading in chapter 45. And I do pray that you get some understanding of what has happened and how it reflects on Jerusalem, but also reflects on our own lives. As God does not change, again, I've said this before, God does not change. The same sinful nature of Jerusalem and the punishment that they took also applies to us today. So be careful as you read, and try to look at what they did, and we can better our lives just by these principles that God puts in front of us. So with that, may God bless the reading of His Word.